They came as slaves, vast human cargo transported on tall British ships bound for the Americas. They were shipped by the hundreds of thousands and included men, women, and even the youngest of children. Whenever they rebelled or even disobeyed an order, they were punished in the harshest of ways. Slave owners would hang their human property by their hands and set their hands or feet on fire as one form of punishment. They were burned alive and had their heads placed on pikes in the marketplaces as warnings to other captives. Now, do we really need to go into all the gory details? We know all too well of the atrocities of the African slave trade. But are we talking about the African slave trade? The Irish slave trade began when James II sold 30,000 Irish prisoners as slaves to the New World. His proclamation of 1625 required Irish political prisoners to be sent overseas and sold to English settlers in the West Indies. From 1641 to 1652, over 500,000 Irish were killed by the English, and another 300,000 were sold as slaves. Ireland's population fell from about 1.5 million to 600,000, just in one single decade. Families were ripped apart as the British did not allow Irish fathers to take their wives or children with them across the Atlantic. This led to a helpless population of homeless women and children. Britain's solution was to auction them off as well. During the 1650s, over 100,000 Irish children between the ages of 10 and 14 were taken from their parents and sold as slaves in the West Indies, Virginia, and New England. In this decade, 52,000 Irish, mostly women and children, were sold to Barbados and Virginia. Another 30,000 Irish men and women were also transported and sold to the highest bidder. In 1656, Cromwell ordered that 2,000 Irish children be taken to Jamaica and sold as slaves to English settlers. Many people today will avoid calling the Irish slaves what they truly were, slaves. They'll come up with terms like indentured servants. This is to describe what occurred to the Irish. However, in most cases, from the 17th and 18th centuries, Irish slaves were nothing more than human cattle. If a planter whipped or branded or beat an Irish slave to death, it was never a crime. A death was nothing more than a monetary setback.
At the time of the Great Famine, most Irish people were poor peasants. They rented land from wealthy English landlords and lived in simple cottages such as the one in this photo. A whole family would often live in one room with pigs and other farm animals. The potato was the staple diet for poor Irish peasants. In 1845, a disease called potato blight struck. Potatoes became soggy and rotten and smelled badly. It was not possible to eat them. This photo shows what a blighted potato looks like. The potato blight meant that poor families had little or no food to eat, and they could not pay rent to the landlord. Many families were evicted from their homes by wealthy landlords. They had no food, no money, and no home. Starving, desperate people flocked to the workhouse. In the workhouse, families were often separated and never saw each other again. Many people emigrated to America or Canada on ships. This photo shows what the ships looked like. They had to cross the Atlantic Ocean in rough seas and sometimes stormy weather. The journey could take months. Conditions on board the ships were often very poor. Ships were hugely overcrowded. Starving and dying people slept beside strangers. There was not much food, water, or fresh air. Disease spread. So many passengers died on the journey across the ocean that the ships became known as coffin ships. It was not uncommon for children's parents, brothers, or sisters to die on the journey. For the people who survived the journey, the destination represented hope and a new life. However, Irish immigrants were not always welcome in the new land because they were homeless and brought disease with them. Statues of the famine victims can be seen in Dublin today. They stand as a monument and a reminder of the people who died and emigrated during the Great Famine in Ireland. The statues remind us of the suffering of the people.
Throughout the famine years, 75% of the Irish coming to America arrived in Ellis Island, New York. Many of the Irish immigrants faced a long battle of discrimination, most horribly by those who considered themselves English Puritans, as shown in the video clip from the movie Gangs of New York. In 1847, New York had a population of 372,000 people, and approximately 52,000 people of that population was Irish immigrants. However, the worst discrimination the Irish faced was not in New York, but in the highly populated town of Boston, Massachusetts, a largely Anglo-Saxon town with a population of 115,000 people. Many Irish, when they arrived, oftentimes fell victim to unscrupulous landlords, who would oftentimes charge them high prices for a 9 by 11-foot room. A family of 10 might be expected to sleep in such a small, tight living quarter, and sometimes the rooms had no sanitation, ventilation, or even daylight. The overflow of Irish would settle into the gardens, backyards, and alleys surrounding houses living in the wooden shacks. Demand for housing of any quality was extraordinary. People lived in musty cellars with low ceilings that partially flooded with every tide. Old warehouses and other buildings were hastily converted into rooming houses using flimsy wooden partitions that provided no privacy. On top of housing discrimination, many posters and propaganda displayed Irish people as lesser humans, oftentimes with ape-like features implying that they were farther down on the evolutionary scale as opposed to supposed English Puritans or those of English descent. In Boston, rivalry between jobs also created intense discrimination. As an unskilled Irish immigrant, one could make up to $1 a day, as opposed to the 8 cents that they would receive in Ireland. This, copulated with the growing anti-Catholic and anti-Irish propaganda, created many problems. Many places were reluctant or outright refused to give Irish people jobs. Many places would oftentimes hang "No Irish Need Apply" signs in store windows, creating less and less opportunity for success. American old social norms created a bad reputation for Irish women and men alike. They were portrayed as loud, wild drunkards who were likely to cause an uproar, very different from the hard-working, good-willed image they had created back in Ireland.
So we built on that then, and we put our heads together to see what issues or what subjects should be addressed. And of international importance, we decided would be an acknowledgement of the Choctaw gift to the Irish people during the Great Famine. And what we did was we put this up as a competition and tendering process. Alex made a submission in relation to the Choctaw Monument. I think there were 3 others, and we formed a committee here in Middleton, and we judged the entries, if you like, under a number of headings, and not surprisingly, Alex's submission for the Choctaw Monument won hands down.
Refamiliarized myself with the history, doing some of my own research. The more I looked into the history, I think what really moved me was the fact that only approximately 13 years previous to that time in 1847 was the Choctaw Trail of Tears. I think between 1831 and 1834, thereabouts. So hearing of this history and how Choctaw had been moved from their ancestral land and over particularly harsh winters, dying in their thousands, I wanted to try and reflect this notion of the humanity that they showed by making this collection and donation to Ireland with work in a visual way somehow, to make this visual link and connection, which is how I arrived at the idea of the bowl made from 9 eagle feathers, round-tipped eagle feathers used in Choctaw ceremonial dress.
In his submission, what he said in relation to it is that the structure is in a bowl shape, and that was to represent a gift, if you like, the giving of, and in particular the giving of sustenance or food. And this action by the Choctaw was a rising above. You know, they had suffered themselves only a number of years before they made this magnificent gesture on the Trail of Tears, and they were suffering under great duress and you know, were deprived and were poor, and yet from the little resources they had, they were able to consider and react on behalf of people half the world away. People they may not even have known an awful lot about. It was enough for them to know that these people were suffering and needed help, and they just went and did it. It should be acknowledged, it should be remembered, and we should have something to inspire us to act in a similar way.